Hi everyone, and welcome to the first lesson in EDUC 75 Assessment in Learning 1, which is the Introduction to Assessment, where we will be exploring the basic concepts in assessment. First, let us look at the lesson objectives. By the end of this lesson, you are expected to have 90% proficiency in differentiating measurement, assessment, and evaluation, as well as in elaborating on the basic concepts of assessment. But before we move to the discussion, I want you to look at this slide. Please pause this video for a minute and think about why measurement, assessment, and evaluation are crucial in determining students' progress. What role does each one play in understanding and monitoring students' learning? Again, please pause the video for a minute and reflect on the question I stated. Awesome! Let's check on the succeeding slides if what you had in mind is aligned with our lesson. To guide you in today's session, here is the lesson outline. Part 1 is about the topic overviews about measurement, assessment, and evaluation, while Part 2 is the focused discussion on assessment, specifically the reasons for assessment, approaches to assessment, types of assessment, principles of assessment, and lastly, making assessment useful and productive. Let's start with the overviews. The first one is measurement. Measurement means collecting information relative to an established standard. These standards can be specific measuring devices or procedures, like information about the length of materials, which can be measured through rulers or tape measures. However, in education, the quantities that we are measuring are abstract, unseen, or intangible. Thus, the learning outcomes to be measured should always be specified. In line with this, measurement in education is defined as quantifying or assigning number to learners' intelligence, attitudes, achievement, etc., based on a specific measuring device or procedure. Measurement has two types: objective and subjective measurement. As you can see on this table that I prepared to compare them, objective measurement is quantitative and is represented by numerical data, while subjective measurement is qualitative and represented by descriptive data. On the next row, it says that objective measurement is considered to be more stable and reliable compared to subjective measurement, which can be prone to bias and inconsistency. Objective measurements can also be repeated and we will still get the same quantity, while subjective measurement can vary based on factors related to the humans and situations involved in acquiring the measurement. On the next row, it says that objective measurement is prone to superficiality, while subjective measurement has the advantage of being in-depth and elaborate. Lastly, the results of objective measurement do not depend on the individual or person taking the measurement, while subjective measurement can be dependent on the individual taking the measurement. An objective measurement is not dependent on the person taking the measurement because the measurement instrument can stand alone. On the other hand, a subjective measurement being dependent on the individual taking the measurement can play as either a strength or a weakness because the quality of the measurement result is highly reliant on the human factor or the individual taking the measurement. One question that you might have right now is, which one is better to use then, objective measurement or subjective measurement? The answer to that question is that it is best to use both measuring procedures if time and resources permit, because these two measurement types supplement each other. One covers the weaknesses of the other. This table is very theoretical and abstract in a sense, so let us see an example of each type of measurement. I have here a specific example. If the goal is to measure students' knowledge of the subject matter, we can do this objectively through standardized tests, in which the measurement procedure is testing. We also have another option, which is to measure students' knowledge subjectively through expert rating, in which the measurement procedure is through the expert's perception. These two examples justify the differences of objective and subjective measurement, specifically the can be dependent or independent on the individual taking the measurement dichotomy in the last row. After looking at measurement, now let us take a look at assessment. Assessment means collecting and interpreting information for the purpose of understanding and improving current performance. It is a more rigorous and systematic process that involves measurement and interpreting that measurement for the purpose of feedback and improvement. In education, assessment is defined as gathering evidence of students' performance over a period of time to determine the learning and mastery of skills. The overall goal of assessment is to improve the students' learning. We will be dealing in depth with assessment in this whole course, obviously, since it is our course's main focus. Before that, though, let us compare it with evaluation, with which even some scholars have inconclusive consensus of whether these two are synonymous or not. Evaluation means passing judgment on the quality of data based on specific standards. Evaluation in education, then, is defined as determining the worth or quality of something for which a reliable measurement has been made. I have an asterisk there for the word something because what we will be determining in evaluation may vary. Evaluation could be conducted on the teacher's performance, the student's performance, the course or program that was conducted, or even the whole school or institution. It is important to remember that the end result of evaluation is always whether to adopt, reject, or revise what has been evaluated. About right now, you may be asking, how are these two things different since assessment and evaluation sound so similar? This is why we will be differentiating them on this slide. Do not worry if you feel like you cannot distinguish the difference between the two because assessment and evaluation are sometimes used interchangeably even in academic papers. Due to this, we will be identifying how assessment and evaluation will be defined in the context of our course. Again, this is an operational definition that we will use in EDUC 75 under me, Ma'am JL, your instructor. From this moment on, we will be defining assessment and evaluation as follows. Assessment is conducted to improve the current teaching-learning situation, while evaluation is conducted to judge the quality of the teaching-learning situation based on a specific set of standards. To elaborate on the difference, I prepared here a table comparing assessment and evaluation and how it will be used in our course. This is actually something that I created from the research paper written and published by Yambi and Yambi in 2020. I summarized their notes in tabular form. Now let's look at how they differentiated assessment and evaluation. Assessment is considered to be a reflective, diagnostic, and formative process, which is obvious on its definition since assessment means understanding and improving the current teaching-learning situation. This is also why assessment is identified as process-focused. Moreover, assessment provides observation-based feedback that will be used for the improvement of the process that is being assessed. Lastly, the criteria for assessment is usually set jointly by both parties that are involved in the teaching-learning situation, which are the teachers and the students. On the other hand, evaluation is considered to be a prescriptive, judgmental, and summative process, which is obvious on its definition as well since evaluation's goal is to decide or designate a value on the worth or quality of a teaching, a learning experience, a course, etc., showing how evaluation is not focused only on the process or how you are doing it. Evaluation is focused on what the outcome is or, technically, the product. Evaluation also provides information on the level or degree to which specific standards have been met. These standards, also known as an evaluation criteria, are set only by the evaluator. I hope that this table and this specific part of the discussion clarified the difference of assessment and evaluation to be used in our course EDUC 75 Assessment in Learning 1. Before moving forward to an in-depth discussion of assessment, let us summarize measurement, assessment, and evaluation in the context of education. Measurement refers to the process by which we identify the attributes or dimensions of the objects or materials that we want to study. As an example, in education, we identify the level of intelligence or the level of performance of the students. Assessment, on the other hand, refers to the process of collecting and interpreting data for the purpose of improving current performance. As an example, in education, we can gather data so we can identify how our students are performing in a specific lesson. This data is then used to monitor and improve the students' performance in the next lessons. Lastly, evaluation refers to the act of passing judgment on the quality, value, or worth of something based on a set of standards. As an example, in education, we can assign specific grades to the work or performance of our students based on the grading system provided by the university. After looking at the differences and relationships among measurement, assessment, and evaluation, let us do a deep dive in assessment, which is the core and focus of our EDUC 75 course. In this part, we will be focusing on assessment, specifically discussing the following: the reasons for assessment, the approaches to assessment, the types of assessment, the principles of assessment, and how to make assessment useful and productive. Let us start with reiterating that assessment is about collecting and interpreting information for the purpose of understanding and improving current performance. Assessment can be conducted both on the teacher's performance and the student's performance. However, keep in mind that in EDUC 75, this is an introductory course for assessment that focuses on how we can conduct effective and successful assessment of our students' performance. With that ingrained on your mind, let's look at the reasons for conducting assessments. First, we conduct assessments so we can find out what students are learning. Assessments enable us to see the degree to which our students are achieving the learning outcomes, what our students are successfully acquiring, and which parts our students are having challenges or issues on. Moreover, we conduct assessments so we can talk about what is important to learn. According to research, conducting assessments help us to be more intentional and systematic in our teaching, which in turn has positive impact on how students learn. Lastly, we conduct assessments so we can improve not only the students' learning but also our instruction. As the cliche goes, there is always room for improvement. By conducting assessments, we could see the strengths and weaknesses of the teaching learning process, which means we could choose to continue and solidify the identified strengths and to work on or reinforce the identified weaknesses. Next, we have the different approaches to assessment which we can observe in action in the classroom setting. There are a lot of definitions of the approaches to assessment. However, I made this simple table here to differentiate them. The three approaches to assessment are assessment for learning, assessment of learning, and assessment as learning. You can use this semantic cue to remember this easily. Assessment for learning is formative. Formative has the word for in it, so just associate assessment for learning with that word. To elaborate, assessment for learning is conducted during the teaching learning process, thus it is ongoing. I have an asterisk there for diagnostic because assessment for learning can also be conducted at the start of the teaching learning process, so you can better plan how the teaching learning process should be conducted. We use the assessment for learning approach to inform or adjust teaching, basically to identify if students are still following or coping on the discussion. Because of this nature of formative assessments, they can sometimes be not included or not in the computation of the learner's grades, unless of course decided upon by the instructor. On the second column, we have assessment of learning, which is easily the opposite of assessment for learning. To elaborate, assessment of learning is summative and it is given at the end of a unit, term, semesters, or any key period. It is conducted to assess the extent to which learning outcomes have been achieved. Simply, in assessment of learning, we analyze the degree to which the learning objectives that were set at the start of the key period has been achieved by the learners. The last one on the third column is assessment as learning, which is easily distinguishable from assessment for learning and assessment of learning, since it is a detached experience from the teacher because it focuses on the learner's self-assessment. As you can observe, I put here an additional idea about education students. This just means that your assessment as learning includes the use of assessment knowledge that you learned from your professional education classes to better understand your own learning and eventually improve your own learning process. In line with that, please remember that assessment as learning is used by the students to reflect on their own learning and helps in developing the learner's personal accountability and efficacy in studying. Basically, it means that assessment in itself can be used by students to improve themselves. Let's say you took a quiz and you realized that there were some parts of the quiz that you were easily able to answer and there were parts which you had a hard time. This exposes your strengths and weaknesses. As learners, you have to use assessment as learning as much as you can to monitor your own learning process. I also included here some concrete examples of each approach to assessment, which you may easily find with just one Google search. Assessment for learning can include the instances when the teacher asks questions or clarifications during the lesson or discussion, or even a short quiz or activity. Assessment of learning can include periodical or term examinations, district or national tests, or even a summative quiz or activity. Lastly, assessment as learning always includes the learner's reflection on their own learning, which can be based on assessment results or even on the assessment itself, as well as while the teaching learning process is ongoing. However, of course, memorizing these examples is not enough. You have to keep in mind the key functions of each approach in order for you to better understand their differences. Let's explore this concrete example. The situation is what kind of approach to assessment is conducted by a teacher who gave a quiz at the end of the discussion. If we want to know whether the quiz was an assessment for learning, assessment of learning, or assessment as learning approach, we have to know more about the context. What is the function of assessment that was described in the situation? In the given concrete example, if the teacher uses the assessment data to understand the strengths and weaknesses and improve the teaching learning process, this is an assessment for learning approach. On the other hand, if the teacher uses the assessment data to determine the percentage of the learning objectives that were achieved by the students, this is an assessment of learning approach. Lastly, if the students use the assessment data to reflect on their own learning, thus fostering self-regulation and efficacy, this is an assessment as learning approach. As you can see, if a teacher gives a quiz at the end of the discussion, it does not really immediately mean that this can be considered as an assessment of learning approach just because it was given at the end of the lesson. You have to determine and analyze how the assessment data was used. Aside from the approaches to assessment, we also have the different types of assessment, which are traditional, alternative, performance-based, and portfolio. First, traditional assessment is the easiest to identify since the students are expected to choose from a given list of choices. Moreover, students are expected to recognize that there is only one correct or best answer. An example of traditional assessment is a multiple choice question. The second one is alternative assessment, in which students are expected to create original responses to answer a certain question. The students respond to a question using their own ideas, in their own words. An example of an alternative assessment is a situational essay question. The third one is performance-based assessment, where students are asked to perform real-world tasks that demonstrate the meaningful application of essential knowledge and skills. An example of a performance-based assessment is a debate or presentation exhibiting the students' understanding of certain topics. The last one is portfolio assessment, which is a purposeful, organized collection of students' works that can be used to describe the efforts, progress, or achievement of the learners. It is technically a compilation of the students' work with which the teacher and the students jointly identifies the key works or outputs that strongly represents the students' learning journey. For the second to the last subtopic in the concepts in assessment, we have here the 8 general principles of assessment. Assessment should be valid, authentic, reliable, current, sufficient, comparable, manageable, and fair. Let's try to discuss them one by one. Assessment being valid means that it meets all assessment criteria and all learning outcomes. Thus, it comprehensively measures the learning objectives set at the start of the teaching learning process. Next one, assessment is considered as authentic if all the work is the learner's own, if the learner is the one who puts their actual effort in the completion of the assessment. Next, assessment is reliable if it is consistent and it generates outcomes that would be replicated if the assessment is to be repeated in another time. Last on this slide is assessment being current, which means that assessment should be updated with the times. It should not be something that cannot be applicable anymore in the present time or something that is obsolete. On the next slide, we have assessment should be sufficient and comparable. Assessment being sufficient means that there should be enough work available to justify the credit value and to enable a consistent and reliable judgment about the learner's achievement. Simply, it means that assessment should measure a good scope of what you are trying to measure based on the learning outcomes. The next one, assessment should be comparable in standard between assessments within a specific unit or qualification and between learners of the same level. In addition, assessment should be manageable. Assessment being manageable means that it places reasonable demands on all learners. It must be feasible for all learners. This is actually related to the last general principle, which states that assessment should be fair and not biased. Assessment should be inclusive to all learners, irrespective of their characteristics, example, their age, their gender, their socioeconomic status, etc. For the last part of this session, we have here 3 tips in making assessment useful and productive. The first one being assessment should be valid and reliable. To make assessment valid and reliable, we have to think about it and plan it well. We should analyze our learning outcomes and ensure that our assessment would include or hit all of those learning outcomes. We should also be careful in making comprehensive and clear instructions so that we could avoid unintentionally making the assessment unreliable just because students could not follow the instructions accordingly. The second one is to give productive and timely feedback. It is important to not only give the numerical value of the assessment to the students. It is important that the teacher should give corrective and timely feedback, which encourages and motivates students in their learning. And the last one for this discussion is the use of the backward design. Backward design means planning with the end in mind. It means setting your expected end results first, then align assessment, learning strategies, etc. with that. In applying this principle in assessment of students' learning, the following are the steps that we may need to do. First, of course, is to identify your desired result or goal. This means looking at what you want your students to achieve by the end of the teaching learning process. You need to develop specific learning outcomes or objectives from the things you have identified. The second part is to design your assessment, keeping the evidences of learning that you want to collect and the learning strategies that you want to use in mind. The first thing that you have to consider in this step is what are the learning evidences that you want your students to produce in alignment with the learning outcomes that you have developed. After identifying the learning evidences, you will now decide on the learning strategies that would be the most appropriate in gathering the learning evidences that you have decided to collect. The last part is to create strategically aligned lesson plans. Lesson plans are not only made for the sake of just creating documents. Lesson plans help us to organize our teaching. With that in mind, lesson plans should be designed in a way that we utilize the learning strategies and gather the learning evidences that we have decided on in alignment with our desired learning outcomes or goals. Always remember that lesson plans should be a healthy balance of being smart as well as encouraging and interesting. Before we end the discussion video, I want to present to you the generalization part where I have noted the key points of the discussion or the takeaways for this lesson. The first main points being the differentiation of measurement, assessment, and evaluation, then an in-depth discussion of the main concepts regarding assessment, which are the reasons why we conduct assessments, the 3 approaches to assessment, the 4 types of assessment, the 8 general principles of assessment, and lastly, 3 tips on how to make assessment useful and productive. And that ends the discussion video for the introduction to assessment. Again, this is just an introductory video. We will be doing in-depth and elaborate discussions about specific parts of assessment in the coming weeks. Thank you for listening, and in the next meeting, we will be conducting your learning activity 2. For this discussion, the following references were used. Thank you so much again for listening, and see you on our next meeting in EDUC 75. Bye!